So if I understand your question how I infer from God's perfection that the creation must be perfect, right? So if I were thinking about reasons to call God perfect, I might go one of two avenues that I will later collapse into a single avenue. But the two apparent avenues are God is perfect because he is inherently perfect, because there is something essentially perfect about him. In that case, it doesn't seem like his acts would need to be perfect. But the second reason that we might say God is perfect is because his acts are perfect. I think that is a proper reason for putting the appellation of perfection on somebody. I think that the former method, saying that God is inherently perfect, is incoherent if we do not say that God's actions are perfect. Because what would it mean for God to be perfect if he did imperfect things? It seems to me that the property of perfection, the description of things as perfect, is only properly applied to things that are perfect. And for a thing to be perfect, I think, means to interact in some perfect way. But something that we missed on the recording earlier was a description of why the world might be imperfect. And I think that what it would mean for God to be a perfect being is that he would be remiss in permitting imperfection in some way, because it seems to me like it's not proper to apply the term perfect to beings that fully capable of avoiding imperfection. For example, creating all human souls in heaven, where presumably people still retain their free will, and would certainly have a much easier time being exposed to God's goodness to make a more informed decision about believing or not. I think that God kind of playing hide the ball with the free will thing is a bit deceptive. To say that we have free choice about God. Some people have never heard of Jesus in this world. You know, there's some people have just never been exposed to the evidence. I think that that's not a free choice because the information is not there. But to answer the original question, I think that the assumption, the proposition that a perfect universe must flow from a perfect God, analytically stems from the definition of perfection.
Right. But you can argue for the first axiom as opposed to the second one.
Sorry, what's that?
You can argue for like the first axiom as opposed to the second one, right? You can say that like there is inherently perfect God, but somehow or another, like with the intent of creating perfection, creating imperfection.
I would say in that case that it would be nonsensical to say that he is perfect.
Okay, that makes sense.
I was just going to say, I actually agree with Chris that perfect God. Can I reply to what
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
so what I would say is that I fully agree that God is completely perfect and he created a completely perfect world. Chris said that why wouldn't he create us in heaven? I think he kind of did, because I think the earth before there was any sin was perfect. That at what I believe will be at the eventual end of time, a very similar situation will arise. And the fact is that if he, in that, I think he created us with free will in a perfect world where we could choose that imperfection. Because I don't think the thing is that if we don't have free will, like, I mean, he could say, oh, I'm giving you free will, but you can't do evil. There's no free will there. Like, if I was to give somebody $10 and said, hey, here's $10, spend it on buying, a 1% milk gallon from, this store and, these three things, and add it up to a perfect $10, there would be no free will. They would be doing what I asked them to do. So I think that to say that God could possibly give us free will without allowing us to have the possibility for choosing something that goes against his nature would not be free will. It could never be free will.
Okay. I'll save my reply for the final speech. Dan, go ahead.
Sort of a follow-up to his perfection argument, because I'm a little bit confused on both of these sort of lines going on, which is I think that you can sort of logically, you can deduct your way in very many places on sort of the assumptions with it. I think if you actually look at the textual stuff, for instance, Old Testament, everything else, I think there's a large amount of evidence that, for instance, that whatever God's perfection, the creation was, God had to work to get the Israelites, to put the Israelites in position. God had to they had to work to do good, to achieve things,
right,
and to work. If you simply wanted to create a perfect world where everything perfectly interacted, that's one thing, but I don't think that was ever a particular claim that religion made,
right,
that bad things didn't happen in the world.
Right, I would concur by saying that even if the God of the Old Testament were real, he would not be perfect for that very reason.
Well, what I'm saying is that the argument you're making is making against a very specific, I don't even start with it, a very specific, I think, version of sort of evangelical Christianity, which doesn't encompass all Christianity or religion. In fact, for more Old Testament focus, what you're really giving us is you disagree with what God's doing in Hurricane Katrina. You don't approve of his decision-making. I'm not sure it's really the place of humans to make that judgment, because that's precisely why they were cast out of Eden, because they started judging God's decisions and whether or not they were justified, and how did he logically reach a position about the apple.
As I understand the Garden of Eden story, that is not the reason that they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. The reason that they were expelled was because they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this has always perplexed me. Even, I was once a very religious person. I had a very profound faith in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. But this point itself, I think, is a source of a great amount of confusion, the Garden of Eden story, because it seems like Adam and Eve did not know right from wrong prior to eating from the tree. I think that's fair. But
they said they did before they ate. Because the very act of deciding to eat was setting them in the position of God.
Well,
they were making a decision
that seems incompatible
they
with the
were
text.
better able to determine what the rules were. It didn't matter whether or not it was justified to prevent them from eating.
Right. I don't want to get bogged down on this point, but I think that's incompatible with the textual evidence, which says that when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the scales were lifted from their eyes. That prior to eating from the tree, they had there's not even the faintest inkling of right and wrong, and then they did. So it seems like what that means is that God put a ridiculous punishment. All of us will die and suffer because of the act that Adam and Eve did prior to their even knowing that defying God was the wrong thing to do. They did not know right and wrong when they ate the apple, so they could not have known that it was wrong to eat the apple. This is essentially, this is executing the handicapped in Texas, the mentally handicapped. They don't know what's going on. The decision was not well informed. Say it was a free decision, I think is a bit of a stretch too. I imagine that a free will defense is going to come up here, but say this was done freely is very bizarre, because God did nothing to say that, you should not violate my word. He said, this is my word. Or there's no good reason to accept my word because you don't know right from wrong.
Wait, I have a clarification question. The grounds for this debate wasn't necessarily like Christianity.
Right,
certainly.
I think we've gone fairly far down that road.
So all these quotations from the Old Testament can be disregarded because it's just
if you're not of that particular persuasion, I would assume you would discard it.
Right, because if we're just doing logical stuff.
Do you want to reply, or do you want to go
That
on?
was part of my read. My read was that they were punished first for the act of arrogance and then for the act of
And why would they have known that arrogance was wrong?
Can I reply to that?
Yeah, sure.
Well, can I reply to that real quick? So my understanding of it is that they were informed that to eat from the tree of good and evil was wrong.
Before
God told them,
before they knew the difference between good and evil.
And before they knew the difference between right and wrong,
on
the whole, they knew the only thing they knew was that God had told them to not eat from the tree of good and evil. So they had knowledge. They knew that they were not to do that. It was the only thing that they were given to know. It was the only thing God told them. Upon eating, they then began to see everything else, and in that they had transgressed from that.
So one question, two questions. The first one is, independent of what religion it is you believe in or choose not to believe in, do you think, and this is for both of you, that God's thoughts or God's ways are equivalent to ours in a way that we can understand his rationale for doing what he does? For example, the question of being a perfect God and how we understand that to be what we see played out in his perfect creation. Do you think that our minds understand?
Sure. Right. So this is a popular line of argument that it's improper for me to judge an action, a natural occurrence of evil because I don't have access to God's mind. I assume that's where you're going?
Well, not even just in that example, but in general. Do you think that we're built, that we understand God's thoughts or God's ways? Do you think that we are constructed in a way where we can?
Right. I'm familiar with this line of argumentation, and by way of reply, I would say that first of all, I think that that argument has a second edge to it that is not friendly to the theistic position, which is that if we agree that because we lack access to God's thoughts and his processes, then it's improper to call certain things evil or blame God for them. And it seems also improper to refer to certain things as good. to say that God is perfectly good. I mean, if we want to say that, it seems like we have to at least assume that we can say anything at all about God's properties and his methods. But if there were a God, I don't see any reason why we would have access to his thoughts. That's why when I construe the problem of evil, I don't say it's a refutation of God's existence. I think it's that on normal evidentiary standards for any particular proposition, it tantamounts to an evidentiary win for atheists, but not as a disproof, because, of course, God's reasons might be totally alien to ours. I question only if that's a kind of God that